We are on page 10 of the notes, and I'm going to go there, I promise, but I just made an executive decision. What do you got to do tonight, right? Everything's going to be closed down, so. No, I just want to really emphasize and concur and encourage you about Paul Pierce and Friends of Israel. And I tell you, I have two reasons. Number one is I was with Friends of Israel for several years. They are a wonderful ministry. I can't say enough for them. And one of the most, I think, important and noble elements of who Friends of Israel is their absolute fixation on the local church. And they have just restricted themselves to working in the context of local churches and helping local churches understand Jewish evangelism and how to understand Israel and so on. And they do a sterling job of it. I just can't say enough for them. But the other point to be made, perhaps as quickly as I can, is this, what Paul mentioned about the importance of understanding the role of Israel in God's purposes. Arnie Fruchtenbaum has a book called Israelology, and I think the subtitle is The Missing Link, isn't it, in Systematic Theology. And that really is such an important concept. I'll tell you something, at our seminary, Shepherd Seminary, have I mentioned this to you? But at our seminary, our dean and theologian, Larry Pettigrew, and church historian, is leading the effort. He's doing 90% of the work, but he's leading the effort to produce a book defending dispensational premillennialism and making the case for the central role of Israel in God's purposes. Amen. And I'm behind on writing my own little sissy chapter, but I'm working at it. And honestly, gotta tell you, his is such scholarship. But I developed this thesis, and this is a thinking, deliberate crowd, and I'm going to bounce it off of you. I'd really be interested in your reaction, but afterwards, okay, I get the microphone. But the thing is, I make the point, and I'm trying to be in this article as ironic, and this is a struggle. This is a fraternal, intramural struggle. These are our brothers, but they are, I believe, wrong in a central issue, and they are cripplingly wrong. But what's at stake, it seems to me, in trying to, as a matter of fact, I don't get lost in this, but I call it a whale and an elephant. Have you ever heard that John Whitcomb? I heard John Whitcomb say this one time. He was asked why he never, you remember John Whitcomb, absolutely the godfather of the creationist movement, and he refused to do debates with evolutionists. And somebody asked him one time, and he said, well, I used to do it, but I discovered that a debate between a creationist and evolution is like a struggle between a whale and an elephant. And his point was, he said, there's a lot of thrashing around and a lot of commotion, but when the dust settles and the foam settles, they never laid a blow because they are in two different spheres. And I'm just, in this article, I'm saying to the replacement theologian, to the covenant theologian, don't measure us by your system. Get inside of our head and understand where we're coming from. And I challenge him this way, and I don't know if anybody will ever read it, but this is what I was after. It seems to me that what's at stake here is the purposes of God. And everybody will acknowledge that God's purpose in human history is His own glory. Amen and amen. It's overly truistic. We ought not to take it for granted, but we so all will embrace that. And yet, my argument is that dispensationalism actually honors that much more carefully. Because let me suggest to you, and that the standard replacement or covenantalist syllogism is something like this. Number one, they would agree that, if you don't mind, history is all about, shall we say, God's glory. It's doxological. By the way, Bookman, keep going. But that word glory is so important. And I mean, it's you got to understand, you know what the Hebrew word is in the Old Testament for glory? Chavod. And chavod means heavy. Now, it's only used 2 times specifically of heavy, Absalom's hair, and Eli, who pitched over backwards because he was chavod. But the point is, no, you remember that story. But the point is that what you get from that, and I will argue, I know modern linguists, just are so offended by this notion, but I think it's absolutely obvious and undeniable that different peoples have different patterns of thought, and the Hebrew people do not deal with abstraction. So when they think of glory, they think of that, and we have this in our culture, in our language. We speak of that which has gravitas, weight, heft, as something that's significant and important, right? Well, what that means is, to the Jewish mind, is that glory, for my money, and I've spent a little time with it, is never simple majesty. It is majesty on display. God's glory is His intrinsic worth and majesty put on display for the world to see. Now just think at the first blush, the greater focus on and commitment to and honoring of this concept in premillennialism, which has a kingdom on earth where every knee bows and every tongue confesses that Jesus is what He claimed to be, the Messiah of God, finish the verse, to the glory of God. That's the point. The kingdom, this triumphalist concluding chapter of human history, if you don't mind, before the kingdom is handed up to the Father, is God's glory on display for all the world to see. Does that make sense to you? I mean, it's so important. But we would all agree that history is all about God's glory. Now, here is, I think, where the error is. Stay with me. The standard covenantalist, and I'm telling you, this thesis, this minor premise in my syllogism, if you don't mind, is virtually ubiquitous. And you're going to bristle a little bit when I challenge it. But the second step here in the argument is that the work of salvation, of redemption, the cross, the finished work of Jesus on the cross, is God's primary strategy in glorifying Himself. The way God has chosen to glorify Himself in the course of human history, the primary strategy is the work of redemption. Is that not kind of intuitive to all of us? And therefore, if those are the major minor premises, the conclusion is, therefore, history ought to be about the work of redemption. So what do you have? You have a covenant of redemption, and everything has to be measured. See how desperately that makes sense? How you get there. I would argue, and I think you'll agree with me, that in point of fact, this is wrong. And I'm not taking anything away. We sing about it, we wallow in it, the blessedness, the bottomless mystery and wonder and grace of the work of redemption. I'm not taking anything away from that, but I'm just asking biblically, is the salvation of men, I'll wax bold to say, the elect, is the salvation of the elect the primary strategy that God is employing to glorify Himself? And I would say no. That in point of fact, God's primary strategy is His covenant faithfulness with regard to Israel. That is the primary. You know what? I was saying to somebody today, I'm not warmly affected by the really millennialist vision of heaven, which is a distant place, another universe where we go off and we float about. And I always think of Gary Larson's cartoon, where he's got a guy in heaven standing there saying, "I wished I'd have brought a magazine." You know what I mean? And we have this idea of listen, heaven will be Eden restored. We will be busy. We will be creative. We will wallow for eternity in blessed relationships. And I think the relationship to this life made perfect. And you know what else? We'll be studying. When you think of coming to a greater and greater appreciation for who God is, that doesn't come just with a passage of time. That comes as we understand more thoroughly what God has wrought. And I believe that human history is in fact the curriculum that we will study throughout eternity. And we'll never get to the bottom of it. And you know what? We will have, think about this. By the way, is there not some hubris in the assumption that God's focus in human history is primarily the human race for His glory? I think maybe the primary audience may be the angels. They're the ones who are so marvelously equipped, the unfallen angels, and they've walked through all of human history. They've watched it. I think they'll be our helpers. I think eternity will be an unbroken series of remarkable eureka moments. Aha! As we contemplate our lives and the scope of history and we look at it with angelic help, I don't know exactly how it's going to be recorded, what kind of books, but I think we're going to ponder what God has done. And you're going to examine your life and your loved one's life. And there are going to be these remarkable moments. A few weeks ago, about a year and a half ago, my dear friend Tom Zempel, I can't think about it without getting choked up, dropped dead on the sidewalk. His widow, Janie, one of my best, is still with us. And I told her the other day, can you imagine Tom jumping up and running over and saying, Jane, look what God did through this. See what I'm saying? I think every element, but the central part of God's curriculum is His dealings with Israel. Because what's at stake is His covenant faithfulness. And Paul said this is what I can be thinking about. I couldn't put it away. Paul said that if you put Israel where they belong in your understanding of the Bible and of God's purposes, everything makes sense. Oh, it falls into place so beautifully. I'm off put by systems. And I don't want to suggest that you can just have this system with all the ends tucked in. There's mystery, but here, let me just, so you hear what I'm saying is that if in fact history is about God's glory, but the primary, now, by the way, could God be faithful to His covenant with Israel to bring a generation of that rebellious people to Himself? Could He be faithful to that? Could He accomplish that without the cross? Of course not. And the cross is a primary means to the end of that. But you see, what's at stake is if we allow this is and Paul said, the non-dispensationalists, the covenantalist world, in North Carolina, you can say anything mean about anybody you want as long as you say, oh, bless their hearts. So I'm saying, the covenantalists, bless their hearts. They got the bit in their teeth. All of the bloggers, all of the big names, all of the T4G in the Gospel Coalition, not all of the Gospel Coalition, but all the T4G for sure, they feel like we have become an irrelevant, archaic museum piece. We don't deserve a place at the table. And we got to do something about that. We got to stand athwart that little side street in theological history and yell, stop. But I'm saying, let me go back to it, that if you allow that, of course, history is about God's glory. But on the other hand, the primary strategy which God has chosen to put on display His glory is His persevering, stunning faithfulness to a covenant He made with a people called Israel. And therefore, history is not about the work of redemption. It is about God's dealings with Israel. Now, that's not to say that they deserve it. That's not to say that they're special. That's not to say that in any sense or to any degree God has somehow neglected the rest of the world in order to Israel. He's putting Himself on display. This is about God's glory, and glory has to be put on display. And the way He has wrought with Israel, and the whole replacement theology, now they've been roundly rebuked and have gotten ashamed of this, but it's built into their system, even though they won't acknowledge it, that what happened was that by reason of Israel's fecklessness and faithlessness, because they abandoned the covenant and rejected their Messiah, this is what they believe, that Israel's faithlessness caused God to reject Israel and reassign the covenant to this thing called the church. That's what they believe. Well, the fact of the matter is, the notion that Israel's faithlessness and rebellion somehow frustrated God's purposes? Is God looking for a people who will spontaneously obey and honor him? Is that out there? Does he expect that's going to happen? You see, it is precisely Israel's faithlessness that redounds so remarkably to God's covenant-keeping character. It's in spite of the fact. Is she a rebellious people? Yes, so are we, for heaven's sakes. But it's that very rebelliousness that, as I say, is a key element of God's plan to glorify himself. And we will stand. Now, when you allow this, that all of history is about God's dealings. I mean, the primary strategy of God in putting on display his glory for the world to see and to study for eternity is his covenant relationship with Israel. And now you can make sense of this age. See, to the covenantalist, everything's about redemption. And so here we are in this age. The cross is finished. The gospel has gone to the world. God is drawing in the elect. Who needs a kingdom? That's all history is about. We go off to another world and we float about and we contemplate God's glory. But, and by the way, there is, you know what? Don't get too fixated on heaven. Honest to goodness. Now, I'm one of the older guys in the room. It's getting closer and closer, you know what I'm saying? And it beats all the alternatives. So I'm thrilled, but I always say I die and go to heaven. And I'm walking on the streets of gold or whatever. I get to see my Savior. I don't know what that intermediate state is much like, but it's certainly to be absent of this body, to be present with the Lord. But you know what? This old world still lies in the lap of the evil one. And all that is sacred is defiled, and all that is wicked and corrupt is celebrated. And oh, how our hearts ought. This is what Jesus meant when he said, taught people, when you pray, after you honor who God is, you pray, thy kingdom come, folks. It's not here. All right? Yeah. Habakkuk says that in this blessed kingdom, the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will cover the earth as water covers the sea. Does that happen where you live? That ain't happening where I live. But I'm hungry for it. Oh, I'm hungry for that day when every knee does bow and every tongue does confess. And it only comes when all right, so let me go back and I'll get on to what I'm supposed to be talking about and I'll be quick. But here's my point. You think about this age. I've looked. And in Galatians, Paul kind of addresses the issue almost tangentially. He doesn't go right to it. But the one verse that I can find where God speaks to exactly, he answers the question, why the gospel has gone to Gentiles. And by the way, can I just say, I'm getting lost, but the distinctive of this age is not that the gospel goes to Gentiles. Gentiles could get saved in the Old Testament, right? Can you say Rahab? They can get saved. The distinctive of this age, and think about what this means with regard to God's purpose that we're talking about. The distinctive of this age is that the gospel goes to Gentiles as Gentiles. Because salvation is of the Jews. And all through God's salvific history, after Abraham, if you wanted to, she who said, your God will be my God, said in the next phrase, your people will be my people. Because to identify with Yahweh was to identify with Yahweh's people. Now that's just the way God built it. It fit perfectly. I could go on and on about it. But now God says, no. And this is so radically different, if you don't mind, that the whole book of Acts is just about getting this across. When I was with Friends of Israel, I got involved and I really fell apart. I bagged on this. But there is an issue you probably know this, about Messianic congregations. Should Jewish folk who get saved, should they gather in their own congregation? It's not that simple, but the point is that Friends of Israel is the one, established gospel, Jewish evangelistic ministry that discourages it. They're not mad about it, they're not ugly about it, they just say it's not wise. And it's Ephesians 2 is in the Bible, and the 2, the whole idea that the middle wall's been torn down. So they resist it. And I got involved in that argument, never knew it was out there, and did a lot of reading on it and so on. The point is, it is so curious to me that here we are in the 20th and 21st century, kind of quietly in the corner of the world that is Jewish evangelism, gut-wrenching ourselves over the question, how do we accept Jewish believers into our entirely Gentile church? I can't tell you how polar opposite that is to everything that's going on in the book of Acts. The whole book of Acts is how do we get Gentiles into this entirely Jewish Christian community? And I say that only to make the point that that's what the distinctive is. The Gentiles can become followers of Yahweh absent any identification with Israel. But I'm back to my question, why? Why did God, this late in human history, this well into his plan, why did he open the door of the gospel to Gentiles as Gentiles? Paul deals with it in Romans 11, where he says the gospel has gone to Gentiles in order to make Israel jealous. I should go there. So let me just go to Romans 11. I really am going to get back to what I'm supposed to talk about, and I'll be done, I promise, by 10 o'clock. No, it won't be. But Romans 11. Let me just, this verse, because I'm not saying it well. What verse is it, Randy? Is it 26? Shame on me. I think it's a little earlier. 11? Romans, that's exactly right. Romans 11:11. That's what I'm looking for. Here it is. And I think this is the place, and it's in a context where Paul is dealing with precisely this issue. The issue before, I believe that the righteousness of God, forgive me, in Romans 1:17 is God's intrinsic right. What's at question here is first of all, I won't talk about Romans 1 to 8, but in Romans 9 to 11, how do you deal with the fact that a covenant-keeping God has set his people aside? How do you deal with that? And Paul's answer, quite simply, is twofold. On the one hand, it is just. God is a covenant-keeping God, and he promised that he would do just that to them. But number two, it is temporary. And he says, with regard to Israel, he says in verse 11, I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? In other words, have they stumbled in such a way that is God done with them? And he says, absolutely not. May it never be. But through their fall, Israel's to provoke, it's a purpose statement, in order to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Now, folks, think about this. You and I are unanticipated beneficiaries of new covenant blessings. Those covenant blessings, and I know we can argue about the whole status of the new covenant. I believe it's going to be given to Israel. It is Israel. It belongs to Israel. That's the whole point. But the blessings of the new covenant, which are twofold, wallow in this. You know what, by the way? I believe that the Lord's Supper is the seal of the new covenant. That when you take the Lord's Supper, this is the new covenant in my blood. You ought to just consciously wallow in the blessedness of the new covenant. And I would argue, Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36, that there are two basic blessings in the new covenant. One is sins once and for all forgiven. Moses never knew that. David never knew that. There was always another offering. This is the whole point of Hebrews chapter 10. In the temple tabernacle, there was no provision for any sort of chair or bench because a priest might have sat down, and if he sat down, somebody might get the impression that his work was done. He was never done. Jesus offered himself up, and then what did he do? See, that's the whole point. He sat down. It's done. And for us to live on this side of the cross and understand what Paul explains so carefully in Romans 3 and 4 about this majestic economy, if you don't know the work of salvation, that this one who is the perfect God, man, has died a death which is sufficient to once and for all cover the holiness of God. This was a mystery to the Old Testament. I don't want to go any further, but this reality of sins once and for all forgiven, which is distinctively new covenant, and I don't think you can really appreciate it unless you're rather consciously measured against what the situation was in the Old Testament. And what we have is better. That's not to say that what there was in the Old Testament. God was so good and so gracious and so loving to all the Old Testament saints, but what we got is better. And one of the ways in which it's better is that we have this understanding, this confidence, this promise that our sins are once and for all forgiven. That's stunning. We should never get over that. And then the second blessing of the new covenant is this, Ezekiel 36, this remarkable intimacy. I like to say that if you take one word to contrast the relationship or the experience, if you don't mind, the Old Testament saint vis-a-vis that of the New Testament, it is intimacy. You and I enjoy an intimacy with God in heaven that I would argue the Old Testament saint would have been offended to hear you talk about. In the Old Testament, God was so good, and he took up his residence in the middle of his covenant people, and there was a tabernacle there and a temple. He lived in the glory cloud, dwelt there. You could come, you could approach, you could beg him. If you were without child, you could do the appropriate peace offering and then come and make a vow with God and wait on the birth of your son Shmuel and so on. But the fact of the matter is, as good as God was, you only came so far, right? You'd never go beyond the outer court, and you never came without a priest and without a sacrifice. We have been invited to come into the Holy of Holies. And the figure Paul uses a prayer in Colossians 2 is the picture of just crawling up on your daddy's lap. And I like to say that in the Old Testament, I can't find any place where an Old Testament saint consciously thinks of God, Yahweh, as his father. He knows him as his, personally. There are a couple of times, Hosea and Exodus, where he refers to himself, Israel, as his son and so on, making a point about his rescue. But the Old Testament saint knew God as Lord and sovereign and deliverer and friend and shepherd. I mean, it was such a precious relationship. But I don't find the Old Testament, and I think that the Old Testament saint, his ears would rattle to hear you talk about God as your Father. I think jaws dropped when the disciples said, "Teach us to pray," and Jesus said, "Our Father." But folks, we know God not only as Father, but as Papa. That is stunning. Now, here's where I'm taking you. I believe that God has in fact provided the blessedness of the new covenant to those who believe, in order that we might live out kindly, graciously, thoughtfully, deliberately, the marvelous, unspeakable blessedness of the new covenant blessings, which after all belong to Israel. And I think that that's part of what, see, when I talk to people about God being faithful and bringing a generation of Israel to himself, consistently what I get, both actually from dispensation otherwise, how can God do that? Bring a whole nation? How can God do that? Oh, it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of resourcefulness. But part of it is 2,000 years during which the people of Israel are surrounded by believers who are enjoying lovingly. This is why it's so important not to wax bold and not to wax proud against those people, but to realize your salvation is in order that God might evoke in Israel a generation of Israel. I think one of the dynamics that's going to be so important to what happens there as the forces of Antichrist gather against Israel to wipe them off the face of the earth. And now as they contemplate the promises of Scripture, and one of the elements that God's going to use is they will have individually and corporately a remembrance of 2,000 years of people who wallowed in the goodness of God that belongs to them. That makes sense to you? I think that we're here. You know, one of my favorite people in the New Testament, believe it or not, is a woman who came to Jesus in Syrophoenicia and asked for her daughter to be healed. And Jesus, for reasons I think we can understand, he's trying to get alone, he's trying to escape crowds, and he says to that woman, "I can't do it." And she begs, and he says, "No, it's not appropriate to take that which is intended for the children and give it to the dogs." And you couldn't blame that woman for turning on her heel and storming out and saying, "You don't talk to me that way, for heaven's sakes." She doesn't. I think her spirit is, look, you're the Messiah, I'm not. You're running things. I'm just begging you, isn't it okay for us to get the crumbs that fall from the table? Folks, what is it in Jesus' word picture in dealing with that woman? What is it that made her, in his word picture, a dog? She was a Gentile. Are you a Gentile? Folks, we're the dogs. Now, that doesn't take anything away, and we get the crumbs that fall from the table, and they're really tasty crumbs. But understand, we're the dogs. I mean, and God has a purpose for us, and that purpose is, and it's not because he loves Israel more than he loves us. It's because he is determined to put his glory on display, and to that end, he has promised he's going to bring a generation of Israel to himself, and it's unthinkable how he could do that, but he tells us that part of the grand strategy is this period where the gospel surprisingly goes to Gentiles, and many Jews get saved as well, but we enjoy the new covenant blessings that they're hungrily waiting for and that are promised to them. I get lost. Real quickly, the tribulation. Folks, the tribulation is about one thing, for my money. If you're here as a believer tonight because God brought you to the end of yourself, right? You know, it's an interesting verse there in John 16, as Jesus was on his way down to the Garden of Gethsemane. He's talking to his disciples the night before he's arrested, and he says to them, of course, they're horribly dismayed because he keeps talking about dying, and he says, no. John 16:7, it is expedient for you that I go away. Because if I don't go away, if I don't take the way of the cross and so on, the Comforter will not come. But if I depart, that is, if I depart through the cross, all that's going to happen, if I depart, then I will send him on to you. And when he is come, he will, and at this point we expect Jesus to say, comfort, console. What does he say? When he is come, he will convict. That's grace. It's God's grace that brings you to the end of yourself. Israel is a stunningly proud and plucky people. And God is going to contrive a world situation in which this man of sin turns all the resources and all the energies of the world to one effort, and that is to wipe all of the Jewish people off the face of the earth. And when they are absolutely at the end of themselves and there is no possibility of hope anywhere, and God again has wrought in their hearts in so many different ways, the white horse rider is going to descend, and glory be, Israel is going to look upon the one whom once they pierced, and God is going to send out a spirit of grace. I love this, a spirit of grace and supplication. You've had that experience. You wouldn't be here tonight if God hadn't sent such a spirit of grace that had brought you to the place you had no other hope, and you supplicated, you begged God to deliver you. That's what it takes, folks. And God, the whole tribulation period, for my money, is just God bringing Israel to the end of herself, so that entire generation cries out and is saved. And let me take it one more step, and then I'm going to be very quick. The millennium. You know, in the Old Testament, when the kingdom comes, when the stone cut out without hands rolls out of the mountain, when one like unto the Son of Man appears before the Ancient of Days and is dispatched to establish a fifth. I have a trick question I ask people all the time. In Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, how many kingdoms are there? There are 5, bless God, because you got the 4, but in each case you've got a 5th world kingdom. And when that kingdom is established by Messiah, how long does it last? Well, it lasts for eternity. So now you come to the antepenultimate, the third to the last chapter of the Bible, and John is given this remarkable revelation that there is a 1,000-year stage. Well, clearly that's just the initial stage of the eternal kingdom. But why the initial stage? And I have had at least 3 occasions, I've been dealing with this in some church, and somebody comes up to me, usually kind of wrought up, and he says, well, you can believe that if you want, but the very idea that God would establish a kingdom and it would turn out to be abortive and he'd have to scratch it and say, what kind of God? Why would God? You can't, he would tell me, I've had different ones say, you can't come up with any explanation as to why there is that initial abortive stage of the kingdom. And my response is, number one, I didn't dream it up. It's in the Bible. So maybe the first thing we got to do is stay with it long enough. Now, I don't know that the Bible is not explicit about this, but I think the kingdom is the final nail in the coffin, because human history is about God glorifying himself. And you can't really understand the glory of God, the patience of God, the grace of God, unless you measure it against our fallenness. Now, I think it's fair to say that, Norm Geiser said, I heard him say one time, I kind of like it, he said that the Christian is like a walled city set upon by three enemies: the world, the flesh, and the devil. And the problem is that one of them is inside trying to throw the door open for the other two, It works. Well, the point is, now you just think about this. If in fact, and I think it's legitimate that biblically our enemies are the world, the flesh, and the devil. Oh, let's think about the kingdom. What is the status of Satan during the kingdom? He's bound. He is not a factor. What is the status of the world, the cosmos, during the kingdom? King Jesus is ruling. There is universal, absolute righteousness and plenty. There's no hunger, there's no war, everything. It is the idyllic society that man has fitfully longed for throughout history. And yet at the end of 1,000 years, and I think the key phrase here in Revelation 20 is verse 3, where it says, Satan will be loosed for a little season. In other words, that quick. And he can mount a vast army of rebels who want to dethrone and assassinate the king who has in fact made this possible. All right, Satan's bound. The world is perfect. What's left? I think the kingdom is God's way to demonstrate, and again, all of this is a curriculum designed for us to study throughout eternity and understand God's purposes and methods and glory more deeply than we ever did before, moment by moment, throughout eternity. Think we'll ever get to the bottom of this? But I think God has crafted the kingdom in order to put on display man's rebellious nature. So now we understand what a good God we have against the reality of what a fallen, rebellious, wicked people we are. Does that make sense to you? Now, let me just say, I think this works to the degree that you honor this syllogism, that history is about God's dealings with Israel, because that is the primary strategy which biblically he has chosen to demonstrate his glory to the human. And again, I think angels who are watching this and studying and day by day staggering at God's wisdom and so on are going to be our helpers and will instruct us as we seek to plumb ever deeper. We'll never get to the bottom, but to plumb ever deeper into the majesty of the God who has proven himself faithful to his covenant. Does that make sense to you? I'm saying that Israel's role is, even in our own circles, underappreciated, and certainly in covenantalist circles is absolutely denied, and it ought not to be. Now, what that means is you ought to have Paul Pierce in your church, and you ought to support him. That's where I'm going, that whole thing. Honest to goodness. Because
you can have a book.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. No, it's any resource you can find that will help you communicate to your people the role that Israel plays. You ought to grab it, because I'm telling you, they're not going to get it accidentally. What they're going to get is the opposite. And their magazine, Israel My Glory, is so helpful, so dependable. I just can't say enough for them. You had enough, didn't you? I'm just started. No, let me take you to the notes, and I can be quick about this, and I'll tell you what's at stake here. You're not believing me for a minute. All right, we are talking, and I say on your sheet here that I call it session number 3, Jesus and his village, how young Jesus was understood by those who knew him best. And let me tell you what animates me about this, and I'm going to take you to this passage. It's a fun passage, and we'll be quick with it. But, you know, there are all sorts, and you're familiar with this, all sorts of, I mentioned the gospel of the infancy with Jesus speaking to his mother at his birth and so on, but there are all sorts of late, almost always Gnostic. Why is that important? Because the Gnostics despised the idea of Jesus' real humanity, because they were convinced that spirit's good and matter is wrong, and so they rejected the real humanity of Jesus, and they write all these stories where Jesus is in fact Clark Kent. It's God dressed up like man. But some of these purportedly tell stories of Jesus as a youth, and he's always a superboy, and he's doing little tricks and miracles. Some of it's kind of innocuous, like when this is the most famous because it's bandied about, but the story, now by the way, all of this is rubbish. All of this is untrue. Everybody understands that, right? So forget this as soon as I tell you. But you know, there's this ridiculous story of Jesus as a boy. He's about 8 years old. He's making, some of his friends have been some rain, and they got a little mud and clay, and they're taking this clay and they're fashioning little animals. And Jesus very artfully fashions little doves and sets them on the rock to dry. And somebody comes along and he's horrified. He says, "You can't do this. It's Shabbat. You can't do this." And all the other boys are so ashamed. But Jesus sort of defiantly takes his little clay doves and holds them in his hand and blows on them, and they fly away. And all of his friends say, "Ooh, look at that." Some of them are much more. There's a story, it's really odious, and you're not going to appreciate this, but there's a story about Jesus in the marketplace one day. A little boy bumps into him, and he turns the boy into a goat. And when his father, I always think the father of the kid, I don't know, but when the father when the father comes to Joseph and says, your boy, Joseph goes to Jesus, and Jesus just reads him the riot act. "Don't you know who I am? Who do you think you are?" And so on. This is in the literature. I mean, it couldn't be more odious. Now, let me just say, and this is where I'm taking you, I think it's interesting, and we're going to do it impulsively, intuitively is the word I want, just to contemplate Jesus' boyhood. And what you've got is Jesus, all right, I don't want to get into the chronology, but I believe that Luke is being quite accurate when he says, I believe, by the way, that Herod died in 1 BC, so there. But I can make the case. But Luke says that Jesus went to be baptized when he was about 30 years of age. And actually, the phrase Luke uses almost certainly means when he was about to be 30 years of age. So for 30 years, Jesus lived as an infant, I would argue. He was brought, we talked a little bit about it this morning, from Bethlehem. When they came back from Egypt, they undoubtedly settled, it says they were in the land of Israel, but now he is taken up to Nazareth as a baby. He's going to live there until he is about 30 years of age, at which time, I mean, he's going to, as I talked about this morning, I like to think I'm sort of giving his mother a kiss on the cheek and say, "I'm going to be baptized." He goes and is baptized, is gone several months. By the way, it's interesting to trace John the Baptist's messages. I say messages during this time, because there are really 3 stages to John's message. The first one is, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It's about to burst in the person of the king. There's no space in Jewish mind between the king and the kingdom. So the kingdom of heaven and the person of the king is about to burst in on you. Now comes the day when late in the day Jesus comes, John baptizes Jesus. Jesus comes up from the waters of baptism, and I'll come back to this in a minute, and the Spirit of God falls upon him, and Mark says that the Spirit drove him into the wilderness. Now you have the 40 days of temptation, you have the temptation itself, then you have the period of recuperation. The point is, we know that because we got the record. John didn't know that. He baptized him, and then he watched him leave. And now his message becomes, and oh, here's a verse that's been done a great deal of mischief, the kingdom of heaven is in your midst. You know what he's saying? He's here somewhere. I baptized him. I don't know where he is. Honest to goodness, that's what he's saying. I know he's here. But then comes the day, John 1:29, when John the Baptist is ministering, and here he sees Jesus coming up from the Jeshimon, and I'm sure John began to leap about and tear his hair and say, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." That, by the way, is the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. That's the first time I like to say that Jesus' baptism is not the first act of his public life, it's the last act of his private life. He just goes in innocent, is baptized, the Spirit of God chooses that time, the Father chooses that God to spend the Spirit. So the point is that now John's message becomes, don't follow me, follow him. You really see what's happening there as far as, now I say that just to make this skinny little point. It's an important point. That you have from the time that and I was headed somewhere and I forgot. Then he comes, Jesus ministers for a time. John gives us, really interesting, the first, John the Apostle, now we're talking the fourth gospel, gives us the first, by my calculation, 5 days of Jesus' public ministry. Because he tells that story in John 1:19 to 28 about the interrogation of John the Baptist. Remember when the Sanhedrin came out and said, "Who are you?" And so on. Then he says in the next verse, verse 29, the next day John saw Jesus coming. That's Jesus emerging from the temptation experience. This is the first day of his public ministry. Then in verse 35 it says the following day he was with 2 of his disciples. John the Baptist was. Saw Jesus, sent him. Remember that? And they spend time with him. Then verse 43 says that Jesus found Nathanael and so on under the tree, but he needs to go to Galilee. So it's about a 3-day trip from down there by the Dead Sea up to Galilee. And then in John 2 and verse 1, it says on the 3rd day. That's the 3rd day after John 1:43. Does that make sense to you? So you've got 5 days into Jesus' public ministry. He goes to a wedding. After that wedding, John 2 verse 12 says that he moved his family to Capernaum. I talked about it this morning. And Matthew 4:13 says the same thing in the same context, that he took his family and made Capernaum his own town. Now, my point is that from the time he's an infant and he's taken to Nazareth until the time he commences his the time he goes to be baptized by John, the Bible is silent. So these very, very interesting years, the Bible doesn't have much to say about. We'd all acknowledge that. There is this one remarkably important passage in Luke chapter 2 that we're going to talk about in the morning. But I think there is and again, I think we're just naturally, and I think nobly curious to understand this period of Jesus' life. What was it like? And this passage in Luke is fascinating. I think Luke is addressing himself rather deliberately to that question. Now, he's not telling stories of Jesus' youth, but he's telling the story of Jesus coming to Nazareth. And this is about a year into his public ministry. By the way, let me show you something. Timeout. Have I worn you out with my timeouts, for heaven's sakes? But here, I have it on the screen. So I'll say, this is the way I teach my students all the time, that we got some, this is a Logos Bible, and so we got some headings and so on. But in Luke 4 and verse 13, you come to the end of Luke's temptation narrative. When he had ended every temptation, departed from him until an appropriate time. Now, in the next verse, Jesus goes to Galilee. And this is one of the places where the synoptics are really synoptic, because they all three do exactly the same thing. They tell you the story of the temptation, and in the next verse, this is Mark 1, verses 13 and 14, and Matthew 4, verses 11 and 12. So I won't go to them, but they go from the temptation to the Galilee ministry. Does that make sense to you? Now, I tell people, all right, for just a minute, focus on that white space right there between John, and it will work in all three synoptics, but here between Luke 4:13 and 14, because all of John 1 to 4 goes right there. That's what you got to understand. So this is not the beginning of Jesus' ministry. This is several months into Jesus' ministry, but all three synoptics, for whatever reason, skip all that goes on. So what do we have in John 1 to 4? Well, we got those first 5 days, and then we got the Nicodemus thing. And John is careful to synchronize his record with the synoptics. But he's clearly, I think, supplementing, if you don't mind. But I say that just to make the point that Jesus now has been ministering for somewhere between 8 months and a year. The chronology of Jesus' early ministry is really tough. Now, as you move forward and get toward the end of Jesus' ministry, really the last year and a half, we can nail it because John the Apostle keeps giving us these feasts. But in the early part, it's really tough. So I'm going to say somewhere from his baptism, it's been maybe 8 months to a year. By the way, for what it's worth, you know what Jesus has been doing for most of that time, I believe, on the basis of the way John tells the story, is gathering to himself the disciples of John the Baptist. There is a question that is never addressed. I wouldn't say never, but very seldom, and when it is, it's very ineffective. That I think you can't get serious about the life of Jesus without asking this question. And that question is quite simply, how did Jesus get away with this? Rome was absolutely paranoid. And I always say, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean nobody's following you. You know what I'm saying? And they had good reason to be paranoid. But they were paranoid about sedition. Rome was a fairly new kingdom, new empire. There were a lot of people who could remember when they collected their own taxes and minted their own coins and had their own army, and now they're under the heavy heel of Rome, and Rome is not an easy taskmaster. Gibbon says that Rome conducted her empire like a well-ordered penitentiary. And you remember Daniel pictures those 4 beasts, and you have a lion and a bear and a leopard, and then what? You got a monster with iron jaws and claws, that devours and tears his enemy. That's Rome. So Rome had this ribbon of land all around the Mediterranean world, from Britain to India ultimately, and she's got this huge army, 350,000 soldiers, but it's stretched beyond its limits. That's why she demanded this road system that's going to become important to the spread of the gospel. But Rome didn't build those roads for Paul to be able to spread the gospel. Let me tell you something. They built those roads. And actually, Rome didn't build the roads. They demanded that every province build the roads to their specifications, and they sent engineers and inspectors. But those roads were about one thing, and that is getting an army from one place to another with all of its machinery, and so quickly, because what they were worried about was sedition. Some corner of the empire where the locals felt like Rome was is somewhat inattentive, and where some member of the hitherto royal family living in obscurity rises up and makes himself a king, and now Rome's got a sedition. And they wouldn't put up with it. They wouldn't put up with it. But for the better part of 3 years, Jesus goes up and down, and you know what? The one place in all the Roman Empire where Rome had more seditious activity than place was Israel. And the one place where they had more grief putting it down, I like to say that Rome, if you're part of the Roman Empire, there are 3 basic working rules. Number 1, you don't raise your hand against Rome. But number 2, if you do, we are going to put it down in hours, maybe days. But we are not going to mess around. We are going to bring such overwhelming force. We're not going to let it go on. We are going to pulverize it. And number 3, 1, you don't raise your hand. Number 2, if you do, we're going to put it down in hours. Number 3, the blood will run for months. We're going to punish you so awfully. Villages that had nothing to do with it are going to be leveled. People are going to be slaughtered, carried in. It's going to be so ugly. But the interesting reality is that, and I like to say that Israel, one of the things you get to Israel and you appreciate this, Israel is like one big extended paintball arcade. I mean, it's designed for guerrilla warfare. And Rome didn't know how to handle that. And they'd bring these huge armies, and the armies would get wiped out by the small rebel forces and so on, and they'd capture all the military equipment, and it would go on for years. And of course, Rome's concern was that all these other nations around are saying, hey, look at over there, those guys are getting away, and so So here's my point. In the one place where Rome had more seditious and more difficult seditious activity than any place in the earth, Jesus goes up and down the countryside claiming to be king. How to get away with it? I think there are a lot of answers. About 2 or 3 answers I can identify. But the big one is John the Baptist. Think about what this means. For several months, John the Baptist, he deliberately gets under the radar. He goes down into the Jordan Rift. And people are coming out to him by the droves. I believe tens and perhaps hundreds of thousands are coming out, and they're submitting to his baptism. And I would argue they are, now you could get saved in the Old Testament. Some are already believers, but they are savingly believing John's message that the kingdom is about to appear in the person of the kingdom. But then what? What does John do? Go back to your village. And so now you have in every village in Israel, you've got scores of believers who have never met the one in whom they have believed. And they are anticipating his coming, and word gets out. This is why, if you check carefully, in Galilee he sends out 12 two by two, and in Judea he sends out 70 2 by 2 in Luke chapter 10. And Luke says that he sent the 70 out to go to the places where he would soon come. In other words, they weren't independent evangelistic teams, they were the front men. And they were going into this and that town, and I'm sure they had a schedule, and they were saying, Jesus will be here on this day, gather. Jesus comes in, does some miracles, makes the claims, and on to the next place. Now, my point is, everywhere he went, there would be people who, how many times does the Bible say that his enemies wanted to take him, but they could not because they feared the people? And think of the genius in salt and peppering the whole land with followers who have never yet met Jesus, but who would give their lives for this Messiah who the forerunner announced. That makes sense to you? John the Baptist is huge with regard, you can't overstate it. All right, now I wander. The point is, I would say that for a couple of years, not for a couple of years, for several months, the Bible stories are, as often as not, deliberately representative. And you have that story in John chapter 1 where John the Baptist is working with two of his disciples, and they follow him, and they follow him. And that's, I think, Jesus is gathering to himself these disciples of John for several months. And now, but I lose my way. Let's do this. I won't quickly. Let's go to Galilee. Because now, maybe, as I say, a year into his ministry, somewhere between 8 months and a year into his public ministry, Jesus does, in fact, come to Nazareth. All right, come on, move for me here. It won't move, and then... Hold on here, I had it, and then I lost it, right here. All right, very quickly. The Bible says that, it says here in verse 16 that, all right, I want to get it to where I can do something with it. It says, so he came to Nazareth, now listen to this, where he had been brought up. Now, Nazareth is a small village. There are various estimates, and there's some dispute, but it certainly wasn't more than several hundred people. You know, maybe it was a small agricultural village, just spread out a little bit. Wasn't walled, and everybody knew everybody in Nazareth. And you know, as a boy, Jesus undoubtedly, I think, there's no reason to wonder to think it otherwise. Every Jewish boy, once he learned to read, it was the mother's responsibility to teach him to read, and once he knew how to read, he would be trundled off to synagogue school, the Beit Midrash. Every synagogue had a special room where the rabbi, the local rabbi, would the synagogue rabbi would teach the young boys and so on, and that would go on until you were bar mitzvahed. We'll talk about it in the morning. But the point is that Jesus... This is the city. These are the people who know Jesus better than anybody else in the world. They've grown up with him. They've gone to synagogue school with him. I think they probably grieved with the family when Joseph died somewhere along the way. They watched Jesus grow into a strong tecton, carpenter, stonemason, whatever you want to say. I think they watched Jesus as he watched over his family. And then some months just before this, as I mentioned this morning, Jesus had moved his family to Capernaum, but they knew Jesus well. So now he comes back to the city where he had been brought up. Now watch this. And it says, as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Now you can read it that way, that it was his custom to go into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. I don't think that's what it's saying for reasons I won't get into. But I think what it is saying is that he went to the synagogue that it was his custom to go to. You know, even in a small village, there would probably be more than one synagogue. And because they were Baptist synagogues. No, but it doesn't have anything to do with that. But the reason is because you wanted to be able to go to synagogue on Shabbat. And the rabbinical restriction was you couldn't walk more than a certain distance, about 1 mile and 2/5. And so you would cluster around your synagogues. And I think Luke is saying that even a small village would very likely, and this was the synagogue that was his family's synagogue. Now you have to understand, a synagogue is not a church, it's not the temple, it is a gathering place, a synagoge. And it's where your whole life is just built into that synagogue. So these people, he went to the synagogue where it was his custom to go. And very quickly, he's invited to participate. Now the standard on Shabbat, Monday and Thursday, Saturday, Monday, and Thursday, there was a regular time of public reading of the Scriptures. And he comes on a Sabbath, and there is a reading of the Scriptures, and I'm convinced, it's not a big deal, but I'm convinced that they read lectionaries so that in every synagogue, even as today, they were reading the same passage, but you do what you will with that. But the thing is that, first of all, are you familiar with this? There would be a special lectern, and that lectern was crafted to hold the scroll, because the ark would be rolled around, or perhaps it was positioned here, the cupboard in which the scrolls, the Torah scrolls, were kept, and they would take out the appropriate scroll and they'd unroll it and they would set it in those standards so that the scroll was tight. They didn't want it to touch the surface of the table, because it might have oil on it or water, and it would get smudged, and the letters would get smudged, and this is the Word of God, and you got to get it right, and the rabbi would stand there, usually with somebody looking over his shoulder to get it right, and he would very carefully, he'd take a little pointer and he would move along and read it, and you would listen as he read it. And then after he got done, the person was making sure he got it exactly right. This is the Word of God. And so then they would roll it up and hand it back to the keeper, put it in the ark, as they called it, the cupboard. And there was always this seat of Moses. You're familiar with this. I always say it's not where Moses sat, it's where you sat to dilate on Moses. So having read a passage from the Torah, the rabbi would sit down and just give a homily of sorts on it. But then there was always a reading from somewhere else in the Old Testament, the prophets. And if somebody had come to the service that day, to the synagogue scripture reading service, they might be invited. So Jesus, he's a local boy, but he's already, he changed the water to wine just up the road a little ways at Cana. He'd made a name for himself. Oh, I'd love to talk to you about this at that Passover where he had cleansed the temple. And the word has gone out that this boy that we knew so well, and he was kind of an unusual kid, but he's gone off and made quite. So now he comes back and he's invited to participate in the synagogue service. By the way, I'm really done in just a minute. But Galatians says that it was in the fullness of times that God sent forth His Son, and it's just so interesting to contemplate and study and try and identify the ways in which that period in human history was so perfectly crafted in God's providences for the coming and the spread of the gospel. But the big one is the synagogue. Can you imagine? I always think God comes to you and He says, here's a city of 100,000 people. The name Jesus of Nazareth has never been heard. I want you to go there and evangelize that town and start a church. Now let me tell you this. In several of the most important neighborhoods, there is a building called the synagogue. And they gather 3 times a week, and they read the Hebrew Scriptures, and they are looking for Messiah. And you, I'm thinking of Saul of Tarsus now, because you have rabbinical credentials, you'll probably be invited to participate. Is that where you'd start? Yeah, that's where the gospel gets off to such a start. Well, the point is, I finished the thought, that Jesus is invited to participate. They hand him, and I don't believe he turns to it. I think turning to a passage. If he said, turn to Jeremiah 14, that'd take about 20 minutes. Yeah, you gotta get on. So I think without a doubt, it was a lectionary, and it was handed to him, and this was all in the sweet providences of God. Isaiah 61, and he reads one of the most thoroughly, unmistakably messianic passages in the entire Old Testament. And now, this is where I want you to see. So now he sits down, he hands the scroll back to the authority there. He says, come on, talk to me for heaven's sakes. Right here. This is what I want you to see. Then he closed the book, Yeah, there it goes. He closed the book, he gave it back to the attendant and sat down, and this is all, and the eyes of all who were in the synagogue were fixed on him. Now try and understand, this is an exciting day. Young Jesus, Mary's boy, Joseph's boy, with his brothers and sisters, but now he's come back to town. They moved away a little while, but he's back to town. And now he's invited to join the synagogue service, and he reads this marvelous passage, and he sits down, and it's time for him to expound a little bit on a passage. And all he says is, right here, today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. I don't believe there was anybody in the room who didn't understand, but he was claiming to be Messiah. And what I want you to see, all right, now I've lost my way entirely, so come to me. Why am I here? Because I think this passage is the most important gospel passage to give us an understanding of the years of Jesus' boyhood and early manhood. And I'm getting it from the way they responded. Because when Jesus made that claim to be Messiah, it says right here in verse 22, so all bore witness to him, and they marveled at the gracious words which proceeded out of his mouth. And they said, now let me tell you what they didn't say. They didn't say, we knew there was something different about this kid ever since he blew on those clay doves and they flew off that afternoon. Honest to goodness, that's not what they said. You see what they said? What's going on? This is Joseph's son. It's fascinating that Jesus kind of bookends his Galilean ministry with two visits to Nazareth here in Luke 4 and then the other one in Matthew 13. And when he comes back 18 months later after the exciting Galilean ministry, and he can't do many miracles, that is, he knows that he'd be throwing pearls before swine, so he doesn't do many miracles, but their reply is exactly the same. What's going on? This is Joseph's son. Now, folks, here's my point. It's in your notes, but I think, am I hanging too much from this little peg? But I don't think so. I think you can argue from this passage that if there's one word you have to write over Jesus' boyhood, it is the word normal. He lived a normal life, so much so that when those who had followed every chapter, every month of that life, who knew him better than anybody else on earth, that is, who knew him better than anybody else on earth knew him, when he made that claim, they were incredulous. This can't be. This is Joseph's son. Now, let me just say this, and with this I'm done. But this is, I think, so very, very important that to understand that Jesus did, in fact, live a real life. Now, think about the stages that are represented in his life. I think there is an interesting, I actually put that in one of the questions, there is a subset of Christology, just sort of a surgical subject, called Jesus' messianic consciousness. Now that word has been kind of misused, that phrase today, but what historically it meant when you talk about Jesus' messianic consciousness was what can we imagine or recover as to the process by which Jesus came to understand who he is. And he had to do it, folks. That's what it is to be a human being. And remember, I'm just going to warn you against something, because a lot of people go here. What is the Nicene formula? I know it's Nicene, but I think it's true. I think it reflects the Bible. One person, two natures. So don't have a divine Jesus over here doing one thing and a human Jesus doing another thing. Don't go there anywhere. It just doesn't work. And it absolutely, it destroys the concept of Jesus' real humanity. So it is the stuff, it's intrinsic to humanity to have to grow into an understanding. Now, by the way, a lot of people put that at Luke 2. I don't think so. Remember this. Jesus took upon himself genuine humanity, but it was unfallen humanity. He had a mind totally uncorrupted by sin. And so he would have been blindingly brilliant, precocious, insightful, intuitive, and so on. And I can't imagine, but what Mary must have taken very young Jesus and set him on her knee and told him the stories of his nativity and the angels and the wise men and so on. I think Jesus very early on would have noticed that there's a difference between himself and his fellows, that whatever penchant for mischief he saw in them, he never felt that. Don't you think? He would have recognized that there is that. But I think most importantly, folks, Jesus, when you read the Hebrew Scriptures, you find Jesus of Nazareth. Don't you suppose he found himself I think his understanding of who he was and what God's purposes were are primarily his devouring the sacred scriptures. But Jesus had to grow, and that's what I'm saying. Just a minute, the people who knew him best are saying, this is Joseph. We know this guy. Okay, he destroyed the curve in synagogue school. We got over it. You know what I'm saying? But the fact is, he's Jesus. He's Joseph's son. And I would argue that in all the growing up and so on, Jesus knows what it is to grow from boyhood into manhood. And we're going to talk about it tomorrow morning. I think Jesus knows what it is. I referenced it before, to wait on God's good purposes and so on. So now, I will say this. I like to say that when he was a boy, he didn't do, you know what? This is a huge theological thing, and I'm not going to go here, but not only would I argue that Jesus did not do miracles before John 2, which says this beginning of miracles did Jesus, so we really have no question. But not only would I argue that he did not do miracles before that time, I would argue he could not do miracles before the coming of the Spirit unless he wanted to just abandon the kenosis. If he wanted to just throw it all off, then he could do. But he was dependent upon the Spirit of God, and that's what happens. Oh, I just love to contemplate what happened when the Spirit of God fell. We have patterns for that in the Old Testament. All sorts of times when the Spirit of God comes upon. Remember the two of my favorite guys back in the Old Testament. You remember this? Here's a little Old Testament quiz. Aholiab and Bezalel. Remember these guys? They're building the tabernacle. Here they are at the foot of Mount Sinai, and they've given their offerings, and they've got all this material, and Moses comes down, and he's gotten all the instruction. But there's a big problem here, and that is you got 2.5 million people who are really, really good at mud bricks. But other than that, they know nothing. And they need skills that a person would spend half a lifetime apprenticing. And God says, I'm going to give it to them. And I like to say that actually Bezalel is the first one. He goes to bed one night, and he's a doofus like I am. And he gets up in the morning, and he's an artificer in every sort of, well, that's the Spirit of God, equipping, enabling. This is Saul. Saul's a doofus. King Saul. You know, the record just goes out of its way to make the point he was a coward and a doofus. He's out looking for his daddy's lost donkeys and so on. And the Spirit of God comes upon him, and he goes and he captures, he destroys Nahash the Ammonite and so on. This is the equipping of the Holy Spirit in this special ministry called theocratic. That's what theologians call it. So the point is, that's what happened to Jesus. Now let me tell you this. All throughout the Old Testament, you have the Spirit of God. Remember the judges, how we say, I think we got the wrong image of Samson. We always think of him as big muscle. I think Samson was about, all apologies, 5'2", spoke with a high voice, had a pot belly. It breaks down at this point, Ben. By the way, I got a friend. You know him, Ron Johnson. He is the absolute prince of bizarre readings. But he was talking about the passage of Zacchaeus. And it says that when Jesus came, Zacchaeus climbed up into a tree because he was so short. And Ron said, now it doesn't say who was short. So it may have been Jesus who was short. I don't think it was, by the way. That's totally bizarre reading, but I lose my way entirely. My point is that I think Samson was a wuss, and the Spirit of God had come upon him. So the point is, now here's my point. All of those heroes of the Old Testament, some of them more noble than others to be sure, but those heroes of the New Testament needed the Spirit of God to come upon them, because absent the Spirit of God, they could not do the job assigned them by King Yahweh without the Spirit, now watch this, because of who they were. Now here's the difference. Jesus desperately needed the Spirit of God because he could not accomplish what the Father had assigned him to do because of who he had chosen to become. Does that make sense to you? But Jesus was every bit. So I'm saying that not only did he not do miracles, but he couldn't have done miracles unless he just abandoned the kenosis until the Spirit of God came to equip him. Now, having said that, my point is that you have all these stories of Jesus' miracles and so on. Look, he didn't do them. On the other hand, he did some amazing things when he was a boy. I like to say, for instance, if Mary came out late in the day and said to little Jesus, you know, it's time to pick up your toys and come in, Jesus did an amazing thing. Yeah, he picked up his toys and came in. So, you know, he was absolutely obedient, respectful little boy, you know, but here's the point. I'm going to leave you with this. And this is only one segment of his life, but I think the biblical testimony, now that's inferential testimony I'm getting out of the response of those who knew him best when he claimed to be Messiah. But I think the biblical evidence is strong that Jesus lived a normal boyhood. And that ought to be the more precious to us, because I'm saying what I said earlier, it's so important to understand he lived our life before us. And thus he can be touched with the feeling of our infirmities. It's real, folks. It's not imaginary, it's not theoretical, it's real. Jesus understands the life you live. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. It's important. All right, I wander all over the place. Let's have a word of prayer. Father.